Hey guys, tonight we step into a moment history rarely softens. If you're settling in from somewhere far away, drop a comment telling me which country you're watching from and what time it is there. There's something comforting about knowing we're all awake together. And hey, if this kind of slow, thoughtful storytelling is your thing, feel free to like and subscribe, but only if it actually helps you unwind. You're standing at the edge of a city that has just fallen. Smoke hangs low, not dramatic movie smoke, but that itchy, eye-watering kind that clings to fabric and hair. Somewhere behind you, a gate creaks open. This is the exact second when being royal stops meaning safety and starts meaning danger. You probably won't survive this style, at least not emotionally, because capture doesn't just remove freedom, it rewrites identity. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are a royal woman, or close enough that the distinction won't matter in the next few minutes. A queen, a princess, an empress, maybe a duke's daughter married strategically upward. Titles blur once hands close around your wrists. Historically, this is the instant where chronicles speed up and then go silent. Captured, they say, as if that single word explains everything that follows. The first thing you notice is sound, armor clanking too close, voices that don't bother to lower themselves for you anymore. There's a mainstream historical truth hiding here. Royal women were almost never killed on the battlefield, not out of mercy, but because alive, you're useful. Dead queens don't sign treaties. Living ones can end wars without another sword drawn. Eleanor of Aquitaine understood this well when she was captured and imprisoned by her own husband, Henry II of England, proof that danger doesn't require a foreign enemy. You're searched, but not roughly. That's important. Hands pause at jewellery, linger at fabric quality. Someone is already calculating your worth. There's a strange, quiet humiliation in realising you're being appraised like luggage at an airport carousel. Historians still argue whether this moment was more psychologically devastating than physical imprisonment, because it stripped agency before chains ever appeared. You're moved quickly, not marched like a criminal, paraded like proof. Crowds gather, whispering your name wrong, testing how it feels in their mouths. A quirky historical tidbit floats up here. In ancient Rome, captured royal women were sometimes dressed in exaggerated finery during triumphs, crowns deliberately tilted to look unstable, as if the gods themselves had knocked them loose. It wasn't enough that you lost, you had to look like loss. Your body reacts before your mind catches up. Shoulders tighten, breath shortens. Sleep, when it comes, will be shallow for weeks. Modern psychology would call this acute stress response, but medieval chroniclers just called it appropriate sorrow. Helpful, right? You're separated from the rest of the captives almost immediately. Soldiers get grouped, servants get dismissed or absorbed. You get isolated. This is where the rules change. Capture doesn't mean dungeon, at least not yet. It means uncertainty, which is worse. A room too nice to feel safe in. Food too carefully prepared. Politeness sharpened into a blade. Someone informs you, politely, that you are under protection. That word has always done a lot of heavy lifting. Protection from whom? From the mob outside, from your former allies, or from yourself, in case despair makes you inconvenient. Mainstream sources confirm that many royal women were technically guests during early captivity, a legal fiction that made future negotiations cleaner. Time stretches. Days lose edges. You start noticing absurd details, because focusing on them keeps panic manageable. The way candle smoke smells different here. The unfamiliar stitching pattern on guard sleeves. You remember odd court trivia, like how Cleopatra supposedly used crocodile dung as sunscreen. No one knows if that's true, but the human brain will grab anything familiar when the ground vanishes under it. You're informed eventually that your capture was necessary. Necessary is another dangerous word. It suggests inevitability, as if no one made a choice. Historians still argue whether many of these captures were premeditated strategies or opportunistic grabs when chaos allowed it. The truth probably shifts case by case, which is historians speak for "we'll never fully know." At night, you replay the moment of surrender. Could you have fled earlier? trusted different advisors. This self-interrogation becomes a ritual. Sleep historians, yes, that's a thing. Note that imprisoned elites often developed insomnia long before physical hardship began. Your mind refuses to stand down because vigilance once kept you alive. The strangest part is how quickly others adjust to your new status. Guards stop bowing. Messengers avoid eye contact. A former lady-in-waiting might be reassigned to someone else within days. Capture doesn't just demote you, it rearranges everyone around you. Power, you learn, is a group project. And yet, you're still watched constantly, not because you're dangerous, but because you're valuable. You overhear fragments, ransom figures, marriage possibilities, diplomatic timing. Your future is being discussed like a menu item. Oddly enough, this was considered humane by medieval standards. You're alive, clothed, fed. Gratitude is implied. There's a moment, small, quiet, when it sinks in that your old life is already over. Even if you're released, exchanged, restored, you'll never fully return. Capture stains reputation. Chroniclers will speculate. Enemies will invent stories. Allies will wonder what you promised to survive. Rumour, once unleashed, is harder to restrain than any jailer. You sit by a narrow window, listening to the city settle into an uneasy night. Somewhere, a fire crackles. Somewhere else, plans solidify without your consent. This is the real beginning. Not the battle, not the surrender, but the long aftermath where history keeps happening to you instead of around you. Morning arrives without ceremony. No trumpets, no attendants announcing the hour. You wake to the soft scrape of sandals outside your door and the realization that your value is being recalculated again. Capture was the first equation. Now comes classification. You are about to learn which role you've been assigned, spoil, symbol, or leverage. At first, you're treated like an object that still breathes. Gifts appear in your room, not for you exactly, but because of you. Fresh linens, better bread, wine diluted just enough to seem thoughtful. These aren't kindnesses, they're signals, broadcast outward. Whoever holds you wants others to know you're intact. Alive, useful. In medieval diplomacy, this was practically a press release. A mainstream historical fact slips in quietly here. High-ranking women were among the most powerful bargaining tools in pre-modern warfare. A captured king might end a battle. A captured queen could end a generation of conflict. That's why Isabella of Angoulême, for instance, was guarded more carefully than entire garrisons. Her body represented alliances yet unborn. You're summoned, not demanded, summoned to a meeting space that smells faintly of ink and old wood. Maps lie open. You recognize borders that no longer belong to you. Men talk around you before talking to you. This is where you become a symbol. Your presence alone implies legitimacy. If you sit calmly, it suggests your captors are lawful. If you panic, it suggests chaos. Either way, you're performing without consent. There's a subtle choreography to it. You're seated where you can be seen but not heard. A crown might be left on the table, not on your head. These details matter. In some cultures, removing a royal woman's headdress during captivity was considered a public declaration that her authority had been temporarily suspended, not erased. Temporary is doing a lot of work in that sentence. You start to sense the hierarchy forming around you. Some captors want you as a spoil. Not in the crude way movies rush to imply. Remember, this is PG-13 bedtime history, but as proof. Proof they conquered something important. Proof they embarrassed an enemy. A captured royal woman could be paraded through cities like a living trophy, her calm endurance interpreted as submission. The Roman triumphs you half remember from tutors come back, those tilted crowns and forced dignity. History loved a visual metaphor. Others see you as leverage. These are the quieter ones. They ask careful questions. They want to know who taught you languages, which cousins you corresponded with, whether your dowry included lands or only money. You realize they're building a flowchart of your usefulness. If ransom is paid, you go here. If not, you go there. If a treaty stalls, you wait. A quirky historical tidbit floats into your thoughts as a defense mechanism. In the Ottoman court, Some captured royal women were deliberately taught embroidery patterns unique to the empire, not for beauty, but to subtly mark them as reclassified assets, threads as bureaucracy. You almost smile at that, almost. You are informed, delicately, that your safety is guaranteed. That word again. Guaranteed until when? Until negotiations sour? Until someone else offers more? Historians still argue whether such guarantees were sincere promises or simply placeholders until circumstances changed. The records are polite. Reality likely wasn't. Your days develop a rhythm. Meals at predictable times, walks under supervision. You're allowed books, but not correspondence, an early form of information control. Someone, somewhere, is deciding how visible you should be. Too visible, and you incite rescue attempts. Too hidden, and you lose value as a symbol. It's a balancing act performed on your nervous system. You overhear your name used as shorthand. If she agrees. When she arrives, provided she remains well. Your consent has become implied, retroactively assigned. This was common enough that medieval legal texts sometimes assumed a captive noblewoman's agreement to marriage or treaty terms unless explicit resistance was recorded, which, conveniently, was rarely allowed to be recorded. At night you replay earlier captivity moments, the window, the fire, the way power rearranged the room. You're learning a new language now, not Latin or Arabic, but leverage. You notice how guards change when envoys arrive, how your meals improve before negotiations, how your walks grow longer when talks stall. Your body has become a barometer. There's an unspoken fear humming beneath everything, becoming irrelevant. A spoil loses shine, a symbol fades. Leverage only works if someone still cares on the other end. This is why royal women often perform composure so carefully. Break down too publicly and you're pitied. Appear too strong and you're threatening. The sweet spot is dignified endurance, a skill never listed in any royal education manual. You think about women before you who failed this balancing act, though history rarely uses that language. They're described as difficult, unstable, uncooperative. Modern scholars suggest these labels often mask strategic resistance. Historians still argue whether silence itself was sometimes a form of protest, or simply the only safe option left. A messenger arrives one afternoon with news you're not allowed to hear directly. You catch fragments anyway. Your homeland is debating, councils convening, coins being counted. You imagine hands hovering over ledgers, weighing your worth against taxes and troops. It's a strange intimacy, being priced by people who once called you family. There's a moment, small, almost absurd, when you're offered a better chair. Cushioned, carved. This is leverage logic at work. Comfort as investment. You sit carefully, aware that even posture can be misread. Slouch, and you look broken. Sit too straight, and you look defiant. You choose something in between, the royal equivalent of neutral face. As evening settles, lamps flicker on, and conversations soften. You're dismissed back to your rooms. Not locked in exactly. Contained. The difference matters to lawyers and no one else. You lie back, listening to distant footsteps, thinking about how quickly capture turned into categorization. You're no longer just taken. You're placed, filed, used, and tomorrow you'll wake up again to see which version of you the world needs most. You don't leave at dawn. That's the first surprise. Departures like yours happen quietly, after the city has already exhaled its morning chaos. The streets are busy enough to hide you, calm enough to control you. When the door finally opens, it's not with drama, but with efficiency. The march into confinement has begun, and it's less about distance than about visibility. You're escorted, not dragged. That distinction will matter later when someone writes about this. 2 guards ahead, 2 behind. Close enough that you can hear their breathing if you slow down. Far enough that they don't look like jailers. Appearances are still being managed. A mainstream historical fact slips in here. Captured royal women were often transported in stages, deliberately avoiding direct routes to prevent rescue attempts. Detours were safety, not indecision. You pass through spaces you're not meant to remember, but you do anyway. A courtyard with chipped stone, a well where someone once laughed. You catalogue these details because control has narrowed to what you can observe. The human brain does this automatically. Focus sharpens when options disappear. Modern neuroscientists would nod knowingly. Medieval chroniclers just said you were composed. Outside the city walls, the air changes. Fewer smells of smoke and refuse, more dust and animal heat. You're placed in a carriage or on a litter, depending on era and status. Curtains half drawn. Enough light to breathe, not enough to see faces clearly. This half visibility is intentional. You're being hidden, but not erased. The road stretches. Hours blur. Sometimes you stop at estates that feel oddly rehearsed. Fresh bread waiting. A room already prepared. These places exist because others like you passed through before. Confinement, you realize, has infrastructure. There are rules for where royal women can safely pause, which households are trusted, which monasteries keep their silence. This wasn't chaos. It was a system. A quirky historical tidbit drifts in as the wheels creak. In Tang Dynasty China, captured noblewomen were sometimes transported at night and housed in mirrored chambers during the day, so reflections disoriented them and discouraged escape attempts. Whether that actually worked is unclear, but the intention is unmistakable: confusion as control. You notice how your guards rotate, never the same faces for too long. Familiarity breeds empathy, and empathy complicates orders. Someone understood that centuries before psychology textbooks. You learn to read tone instead. The one who clears his throat before speaking, the one who avoids your eyes, these micro-signals become your weather forecast. There's a moment when you realize you're being shown, just a little, at a crossroads, at a river crossing. Locals glance up, curious. Not enough to riot, not enough to intervene, just enough to let news travel. She passed through here. Proof of possession without the risk of spectacle. You are learning the difference between parade and procession. At night, confinement tightens. Doors close fully. Windows narrow. You're no longer a guest. You're not yet a prisoner in the dungeon sense, but the language has shifted. Guards now stand watch instead of escort. Meals arrive on trays. You eat alone. Historians still argue whether this transitional isolation was meant to break resistance or simply streamline logistics. The sources are silent. You are not. Sleep comes in fragments. You dream of maps folding in on themselves, of crowns melting into bowls, of fire again. Remember that fire from the first night. It returns, smaller now, contained. Your mind is trying to make continuity out of disruption. It's not doing a great job. The road eventually ends somewhere that feels deliberately unremarkable. Not a capital, not a ruin, a place chosen precisely because no one sings about it. You're led inside, and the air is cool, damp with stone. This is where movement stops. Confinement becomes location. Your quarters are neither luxurious nor cruel. A bed, a table, a single window placed high enough to prevent meaningful views. This is intentional moderation. Too harsh and you become a martyr. Too soft and you become complacent. Someone has studied this balance, possibly by watching others fail it. You're informed, again, politely, that this is temporary. Temporary until negotiations conclude. Temporary until a decision is made. Temporary is the most elastic word in captivity. Eleanor of Aquitaine spent 16 years in temporary confinement. That's not a cautionary tale yet, just a historical echo tapping on the walls. Your daily routine is announced like a courtesy. Walks at set times, reading permitted, writing monitored. You're allowed a small retinue if status demands it, but they are carefully selected. Loyalty is screened. Silence is prized. A quirky aside floats up. Some captured queens deliberately taught their attendants nonsense prayers or invented rituals just to see if rumours of them spread. Information leaks were a way to test confinement boundaries. Petty? Maybe. Human? Absolutely. You start marking time by light, the way it moves across the floor, the way it fades earlier than you expect. Your body adapts before your emotions do. Hunger recalibrates. Muscles soften. Shoulders drop. This physical adjustment feels like betrayal at first, as if survival itself is collaboration. Historians still argue whether adaptation should be read as resilience or resignation. You decide it's neither. It's biology. Messages arrive about you, not to you. Decisions are made nearby, not within reach. Occasionally someone asks your opinion, framed as courtesy. You learn to answer carefully. Say too much and you reveal leverage. Say too little and you're labelled uncooperative. This conversational tightrope becomes your main occupation. There's a sound you grow used to. Keys, not clanking chains, keys turning smoothly. They symbolize permission, not force. You are contained by access, not violence. It's subtle, effective, and deeply unsettling. As days settle into weeks, the march feels complete. You're no longer moving through captivity. You're inside it. The outside world becomes theoretical. News arrives distorted, delayed, filtered. You catch yourself forgetting the exact color of your old chambers. The mind edits memories to reduce pain. That's not weakness. That's maintenance. You sit one evening by your small window, watching light drain from the sky. Somewhere, negotiations inch forward. Somewhere else, plans change. You're still central, still valuable, but now you're stationary. Like a piece placed on a board and left to wait. And waiting, you're learning, is its own kind of confinement. The room you're in stops feeling temporary sometime after the first week, not because anyone says so, but because your body learns its dimensions. 3 steps from bed to table, 5 from table to door. You could walk it in the dark now, which you do sometimes, just to prove you still can. Cells fit for crowns were never meant to feel like cells at first. They were meant to feel reasonable. Stone walls hold temperature like memory, cool in the morning, damp by evening. You start noticing how sound behaves here. Your footsteps echo too much. Your voice, when you speak aloud just to hear it, comes back slightly altered. A mainstream historical fact slips in quietly. Many royal women were held in modified guest chambers rather than dungeons because optics mattered. A queen in chains created unrest. A queen housed securely created paperwork. The furnishings are deliberate, nothing sharp, nothing heavy enough to move easily, curtains thick enough to block drafts and views. You understand now that comfort can be a restraint. It keeps you alive, calm, manageable. Historians still argue whether such environments were designed with psychological insight or arrived at accidentally through trial and error. Either way, they worked often enough to be repeated. Your routine becomes ritualized. Morning light, simple food, supervised walk, reading, waiting. Routine is survival, but it's also erosion. Days slide into one another without edges. You catch yourself measuring time by meals again, like a child or a patient. That realization stings more than the confinement itself. You're allowed small expressions of status. Better fabric, polished utensils, a chair with arms. These details whisper, you're still you, while everything else screams, but only within these walls. A quirky historical tidbit surfaces. Mary, Queen of Scots, once complained that her embroidery scissors were confiscated, not because they were dangerous, but because they gave her too much autonomy over her own time. Control, it turns out, extends to hobbies. Guards change. Seasons shift. You notice the light thinning earlier, the air growing heavier. Winter presses in. Fires are permitted, but carefully tended by others. You're not trusted with flame alone. Fire means choice. Choice is dangerous. Remember that first fire you watched from afar? This one is closer, but still not yours. Occasionally, visitors arrive. Clergy, envoys, women assigned to observe you under the guise of companionship. Conversations feel staged. Questions loop back to alliances, loyalty, temperament. You answer gently, precisely. This is diplomacy reduced to survival. Historians still argue whether these visits were sincere pastoral care or intelligence gathering. You suspect the answer is yes. Your sense of self stretches oddly. You're still royal in your thoughts. Still correct posture automatically. Still censor your expressions. But you're also adapting. You learn which floorboard creaks, which guard lingers, which hour brings silence. This duality, dignity paired with vigilance, becomes your normal. There's a strange comfort in predictability. That realization scares you. You remember how chaos felt during capture, how every second demanded alertness. Now, monotony does the work for your captors. You settle because there's nowhere to settle into except here. Psychologists centuries later would call this institutionalization. Chroniclers just called it quiet behavior. Letters are read before reaching you, if they reach you at all. You're allowed to write under supervision, every word weighed. Some royal women used this to their advantage, crafting letters that said one thing plainly and another through structure, spacing, or religious references. A quirky aside, certain abbesses were known to read between lines literally, counting syllables for hidden meaning. You file that away, just in case. Your body changes, muscles soften, hands lose calluses you didn't realize you had. You develop aches from stillness rather than strain. This is how captivity marks you without scars. Historians still argue whether such physical changes influenced later portrayals of captive queens as weakened or delicate. Art, after all, records outcomes more than causes. You're informed, periodically, that talks continue, that progress is being made, that patience is appreciated. Appreciation becomes a currency here. You learn to accept it without believing it. Each update resets hope just enough to keep despair from hardening into something dangerous. At night, the room feels smaller. Sounds travel differently. You hear distant laughter from guards who are off duty. Life continues around your pores. This contrast sharpens loneliness. You're surrounded constantly, yet deeply alone. Royal isolation was considered protective. In practice, it was corrosive. You start to talk to objects, the window, the table, not because you're losing grip, but because dialogue keeps thought from stagnating. Mary of Hungary reportedly named her chamber furnishings during long confinement. Historians debate whether this was eccentricity or coping. You're leaning toward coping. One evening, you're allowed a candle on your table, alone. The flame is small, steady. You watch it closely, feeling something loosen in your chest. Fire again, but this time contained and permitted. It's a reminder that not all control is absolute. Small allowances exist and they matter. You think about how this room will be described later, if at all. Comfortable confinement, honourable custody. Phrases that smooth over the lived texture of this place. Stone dust in your lungs. Silence pressing against your ears. Time stretching thin. The cell fits your crown now. That's the most unsettling part. You could still wear it here, metaphorically speaking, but it would scrape the ceiling. Power hasn't vanished, it's just been compressed. You lie down, listening to the quiet tick of something mechanical beyond the wall. A clock, maybe, or a water wheel. Time is moving, even if you're not. And tomorrow, you'll wake up and walk the same 3 steps again, carrying a crown no one can see. The idea is introduced gently, the way dangerous ideas often are. Not as a demand, not even as a proposal, more like a possibility that happens to keep resurfacing. Marriage. The word drifts into conversations like incense, meant to soothe, meant to sanctify what is really a transaction. You're told it could bring stability, peace, closure. No one mentions consent unless you do first. Forced marriages were one of the most common endpoints for captured royal women, a mainstream historical fact that tends to get wrapped in euphemism. Chroniclers preferred phrases like strategic union or political reconciliation. In reality, captivity narrowed choices until agreement looked voluntary from the outside. You weren't pushed down the aisle, you were edged toward it patiently until resistance felt impractical. You're given time to consider. Time, here, is another illusion. Weeks pass, visitors increase, conversations circle the same points. Your safety, your future children, the good of the realm. The repetition wears you down more effectively than threats ever could. Historians still argue whether this slow pressure approach was intentional or simply the byproduct of prolonged negotiations. Either way, the outcome was often the same. The potential spouse is described carefully, their virtues highlighted, their flaws softened. You notice what's omitted: age gaps, previous marriages, reputation. You're not being sold exactly, but you're being marketed. This is diplomacy with a dowry attached. You're allowed to meet sometimes under supervision. These meetings are performances layered on performances. You sit straighter than usual, smile at the right moments, speak just enough to appear agreeable without giving away leverage. The other person performs too, whether they want to or not. You're both trapped in roles written by people who won't live with the consequences. A quirky historical tidbit surfaces to distract you. Byzantine princesses sent into forced marriages were sometimes taught to deliberately mispronounce certain words in their new language, a subtle way of retaining identity while appearing compliant. Whether this was widespread or just clever rumour, historians still argue. You file it away as proof that resistance doesn't always shout. You're told the marriage would end your confinement. That's the sharpest hook. Freedom reframed. Not release exactly, but relocation. Different walls, different rules. The promise of movement again. Your body reacts before your mind finishes objecting. Shoulders loosen. Breath deepens. That response scares you. Religion enters the conversation next, as it often did. Marriage framed as divine will, as duty, as sacrifice. Clergy speak softly, convincingly. They've practiced this tone. You wonder how many women before you heard the same scriptures repurposed as policy. Historians still argue whether faith offered genuine comfort in these moments, or simply another layer of pressure. Probably both, depending on the night. You're asked what conditions you would require. This feels empowering until you realize the boundaries are already drawn. You can negotiate household staff, religious practice, dowry terms. You cannot negotiate the marriage itself. Choice is offered only where refusal isn't an option. Your captors frame this as generosity. They could force you, they imply. Instead, they're including you. Gratitude is expected. You learn to express it carefully, because gratitude can be mistaken for agreement. Silence, too, can be mistaken. Every reaction becomes evidence. You think about lineage, about how your body is being positioned as a bridge between enemies. Heirs imagined before affection, wombs discussed in the same breath as borders. This wasn't metaphorical. Treaties often specified how many children a union was expected to produce. Failure to conceive could reignite conflict. No pressure. At night, you weigh the alternatives. Continued confinement. Transfer to a monastery. Exile. None are clean escapes. Marriage, at least, comes with motion, relevance, survival. You hate that the logic works. That's the real cruelty. Not coercion, but persuasion shaped by circumstance. A historical echo drifts in. When Eleanor of Aquitaine's daughters were used in marriage alliances after her imprisonment, the unions reshaped Europe for centuries. Individual lives bent into continental geometry. You are painfully aware that your own discomfort could echo far beyond you. You're given a date, framed as flexible. You're given garments, framed as gifts. Tailors arrive. Fabric is measured against your skin. This intimacy feels more violating than guards ever did. Your body is being prepared for a future you didn't choose, and everyone involved treats it as progress. There's a moment, small, private, when you let yourself grieve the version of your life that didn't involve this room, these negotiations, this narrowing. You don't sob, you don't rage. You just sit, hands folded, and acknowledge loss. That too is survival. When you finally speak your acceptance, or something close enough to be recorded as such, it feels strangely anticlimactic. No thunder, no release, just nods, pens scratching, plans accelerating. You're congratulated. The tone shifts immediately. You're no longer a problem to be managed. You're a solution to be deployed. The door to your room doesn't open yet, but it will. Soon. You're told that with marriage comes a new chapter. Different expectations, different scrutiny. The cell may disappear, but captivity won't entirely. It will just wear a new shape. You lie down that night thinking about vows you haven't spoken, faces you haven't memorized, children you haven't decided to want. Peace has been negotiated. For everyone but you, it seems. No one asks you how you feel about children. They ask when. Motherhood enters the conversation as an assumption, not a question, the way weather does. Inevitable. Discussed in advance, planned around. In captivity, or just after it, your body becomes a timetable other people check regularly. Historically, this part is well documented, Royal women were expected to produce heirs quickly after forced or strategic marriages, a mainstream fact that sounds tidy in textbooks and feels terrifying up close. Heirs meant stability. They also meant insurance. Once a child existed, your value shifted again. You were no longer just leverage. You were a vessel that had delivered something irreplaceable. If you are still confined when pregnancy becomes possible, surveillance intensifies. Diet monitored. Movement restricted further. Not out of care exactly, but out of preservation. You are no longer being protected for negotiations, but for continuity. The irony lands hard. Your captivity tightens as your importance peaks. You learn to read rooms for pregnancy speculation, lingering looks, polite concern masked as curiosity. In some courts, women assigned to attend you were instructed to report physical changes in detail. A quirky historical tidbit surfaces here. In certain medieval courts, servants were rewarded for early pregnancy confirmation with coin or cloth, turning your body into a rumour economy. Historians still argue how widespread this practice was, but the obsession itself is undeniable. If you conceive, your world shrinks again. Travel postponed, decisions delayed for your condition. The language softens, but the effect is the same. You are kept still, safe, watched. Your body becomes public property in the quietest way possible. Every ache is noted, every craving interpreted. You feel fear that doesn't quite have a name. Not fear of childbirth, that's a later problem, but fear of failure. Miscarriage wasn't just personal tragedy in royal contexts, it could be political disaster. Women were blamed for losses they couldn't prevent, sometimes accused of divine disfavour or moral weakness. Historians still argue whether these accusations reflected genuine belief or convenient scapegoating. Living inside it, the distinction feels academic. If you do not conceive, the pressure warps differently. Treatments suggested, pilgrimages encouraged, relics offered. Your confinement may even deepen, framed as rest or prayer. You start to feel like time itself is leaning on you, impatient. Some women gave birth while still technically prisoners. The rooms prepared carefully. Midwives vetted for loyalty, guards stationed outside. A mainstream historical fact often overlooked. Births of royal children in captivity were meticulously recorded to establish legitimacy beyond dispute. Witnesses mattered. Even your pain required documentation. Motherhood, when it arrives, doesn't free you. It anchors you. The child is celebrated immediately, often removed just as quickly. Fostered elsewhere for safety, raised in enemy courts. This separation is described as practical. It feels like theft. You learn that your role was never meant to include daily presence, only production. There's a moment, small, devastating, when you realize your child might grow up speaking a language you don't, praying to a God you were told to abandon, loving people who once locked your door. That thought stays with you longer than any physical discomfort. If the child remains with you, even briefly, surveillance doubles. You are watched not just as a woman, but as a potential influence. Lullabies become suspect, stories monitored, affection measured. Historians still argue whether captors feared rebellion through upbringing or simply wanted ideological control. Either way, intimacy becomes regulated. You adapt, because adaptation is what you do now. You learn to express love efficiently, quietly, in ways that won't be punished or misinterpreted. You memorize your child's face faster than you think possible, storing details like contraband, the curve of a cheek, the sound of breathing during sleep. A strange thing happens to time during this phase. Days feel both heavier and faster. Your world revolves around another body now, and yet decisions about that body are rarely yours. This contradiction strains something deep. Some women broke under it, others hardened. Chroniclers later describe both outcomes as personality traits, not survival strategies. You hear whispers about future marriages for your children, alliances already forming, the cycle revealing itself. You understand now how captivity doesn't end with release. It reproduces itself quietly through lineage. At night, when everything settles, you sit with a child sleeping nearby, or with the absence where one should be, and you feel a complicated gratitude. You survived long enough to reach this point. You also feel anger that survival came with such terms. Motherhood was supposed to crown you. Instead, It binds you tighter to a system that never asked what you wanted. You love fiercely anyway, because that's the one rebellion no one can fully monitor. And as you lie back, listening to the soft, unfamiliar rhythms of a life shaped by others, you realize captivity didn't just take years from you. It drafted your future and your children's into the same long negotiation. Belief becomes quieter here, not louder. You don't suddenly find religion in a cinematic way. Instead, faith slips into the corners of your day, filling the spaces where control runs out. Ritual becomes survival, not because it promises rescue, but because it gives shape to hours that would otherwise blur into nothing. Historically, captured royal women were often encouraged, sometimes pressured, to lean into religion, a mainstream fact well attested in letters and court records. Piety was safe, piety was controllable. A praying queen looked compliant, not plotting. You're offered prayer books, rosaries, time with clergy, all framed as kindness, all monitored. You accept some of it willingly. Structure is a gift when freedom is rationed. Morning prayers mark a beginning. Evening prayers create an end. The day stops leaking everywhere. You notice your breathing slow when words repeat. Even skepticism benefits from rhythm. But belief here isn't just about gods. It's about habits. You create small rituals that no one assigns. Counting steps during walks. Touching the same spot on the wall each night. Folding fabric a certain way. These actions become anchors. Psychologists would later call this grounding. You call it getting through the day. A quirky historical tidbit surfaces as you trace familiar patterns. Some imprisoned noblewomen kept shadow calendars, tracking time by saints' days or moon cycles when official dates were withheld. Historians still argue whether this was widespread or anecdotal, but the impulse makes sense. Time that isn't counted feels stolen. You notice how religion is used differently by those around you. Clergy speak of humility, guards speak of duty, envoys speak of divine order aligning conveniently with treaties. Faith bends easily when power applies pressure. You listen carefully, separating belief from performance. Sometimes belief fails you. Prayers feel flat. Words echo without comfort. On those days, superstition creeps in instead. You avoid stepping on certain stones. You wear the same garment on days when news arrives. You tell yourself it doesn't matter, and then you do it anyway. Humans have always mixed theology with habit when certainty disappears. You remember stories of queens accused of witchcraft during or after captivity. Women whose survival strategies were later rebranded as suspicion. Talking to objects, repeating phrases, keeping charms. Historians still argue whether these accusations reflected genuine fear or convenient narrative cleanup. Either way, you keep your private rituals subtle. You're observed during prayer. That's the strangest part. Faith, which should be internal, becomes a performance. Kneel too long, and you're suspected of fanaticism. Kneel too briefly, and you're judged irreverent. Even devotion has acceptable limits. You find unexpected comfort in routine clergy visits, even when you distrust their motives. Familiar voices, predictable questions. The human brain relaxes around repetition. That doesn't mean you believe everything said. It just means you're still human enough to need contact. At night, when the room darkens and the world recedes, belief shifts again, less formal, more personal. You talk, not necessarily to a god, but to the idea that something exists beyond these walls, something uncounted, unrecorded. That thought alone creates space to breathe. A mainstream historical note hums beneath this. Many royal women wrote their most introspective, philosophical texts during captivity. Letters, prayers, meditations. Confinement stripped away ceremony and left thought exposed. Some of those writings survive. Others were destroyed because they revealed too much interior life. Silence was often safer. You test small acts of spiritual resistance, choosing a saint associated with endurance rather than obedience, emphasizing mercy over hierarchy in your readings. These are not revolutions, they are adjustments, but they remind you that interpretation still belongs to you. Fire returns again, always fire. A candle during evening prayer, a hearth tended by others. You watch embers glow and fade, thinking about how belief works the same way. not constant flame, intermittent heat, enough to last the night. You realize that rituals aren't just for comfort, they're for memory. They preserve a version of you that existed before capture. The you who chose when to pray, what to believe, how to doubt. That version hasn't disappeared. It's just quieter. Historians still argue whether faith sustained captive royal women or merely softened the edges of despair. From inside it, the answer feels simpler. It gave you something no one could fully confiscate, meaning you didn't have to explain. As sleep approaches, prayers slow into murmurs, then into thoughts, then into silence. You lie still, hands folded, not out of obedience, but out of habit. Outside, the world continues negotiating, calculating, waiting. Inside, you hold on to rhythm. Breath in, breath out. Another day survived without vanishing. You become a number without ever seeing the ledger. Not immediately, not crudely, but steadily. Conversations shift tone. Words like worth, terms, and exchange start appearing more often, wrapped in politeness. This is the phase where you are no longer just royal, or even just captive. You are currency. Ransoms were a common fate for captured noblewomen, a mainstream historical fact that sounds transactional because it was. Gold, land rights, political concessions. Your release could be calculated down to the last clause. In some cases, your presence alone stalled wars. Why fight when the enemy's queen is already in your possession? You're told negotiations are progressing. That phrase becomes background noise. What you notice instead are the small indicators. Better food when talks go well. Longer silences when they don't. You learn to read mood the way sailors read wind. This isn't intuition. It's survival training delivered by circumstance. There's something uniquely disorienting about knowing your freedom has a price and not knowing the number. Too low, and you're insulted. Too high, and you're unattainable. Somewhere, people debate your value using criteria you can't influence. Treasury health, public opinion, strategic timing. Your personality, your wishes, your endurance, irrelevant. A quirky historical tidbit surfaces as you overhear a fragment about land boundaries. Some medieval ransoms were paid partly in livestock, including sheep and cattle, with contracts specifying breed quality. Historians still argue how often women were literally valued in animals, but the existence of such records says enough. You picture yourself translated into numbers, then into wool. You are occasionally asked for input, not because it's needed, but because it signals goodwill. Would you accept a partial release? Would you travel under guard? Would you agree to certain conditions post-release? Each question is framed as collaboration. Each answer narrows the exit. Sometimes you're not meant to be released at all. Sometimes your captivity is the point. Holding you blocks succession, weakens morale, forces concessions without ever cashing you in. This was particularly true when you were closely tied to legitimacy. A queen out of circulation is a problem that doesn't need solving, only maintaining. You start to understand that time itself is part of the transaction. Delay increases pressure on the other side. Impatience works against you. You learn to wait without appearing eager, to receive updates with calm neutrality. This emotional discipline is exhausting. You rest by becoming unreadable. Historians still argue whether some royal women manipulated these negotiations subtly, hinting at fragility to speed release or resilience to raise their value. The records are too polite to confirm. From inside the waiting, the idea of control feels laughable and necessary at the same time. There's a moment when you realize your captors are also trapped by the process. Guards grumble about prolonged duty. Envoys age visibly. Negotiations create their own kind of captivity. This doesn't comfort you much, but it reframes the power dynamic. No one moves freely once currency enters the room. Your name appears in documents you're not allowed to read. Titles adjusted, honorifics added or removed strategically. Language becomes a tool. You are referred to as our guest or the lady in question, depending on leverage needs. Identity flexes to fit the deal. At night, you imagine the exchange itself, the handover, the moment of crossing an invisible line. Would it be dramatic, ceremonial, or quietly bureaucratic, like changing guards? Most exchanges were the latter. No speeches, just signatures and movement. History often hides its turning points behind paperwork. You worry about what conditions will follow you, restrictions on movement, obligations to remain neutral, marriages enforced retroactively. Freedom, when purchased, often arrives with fine print. You know this because you've seen the drafts, even if you haven't seen the ink. Fire appears again, this time in your imagination. A counting house with candles burning low as clerks tally figures. Wax dripping like time, you picture your life measured in margins. The image sticks. When negotiations stall, rumours fill the gap. You hear whispers of abandonment, of changing priorities, of new wars eclipsing old ones. This is the darkest phase. Currency loses value when markets shift. You remind yourself that attention always returns eventually. You are still too valuable to forget. You hope. A mainstream historical echo surfaces. When the French Queen Ingeborg was set aside and later revalued due to shifting alliances, her years of isolation were effectively a political pause. She didn't change. Circumstances did. That thought steadies you. Eventually news arrives. Real news. A decision has been made. Release, exchange, transfer. The form matters less than the movement. You will move again. That alone feels like victory. You prepare without celebration. Experience has taught you that transitions are dangerous. Deals unravel. Conditions change. You keep your emotions packed tightly, ready to unpack them later. Tonight, you sit quietly, knowing your worth has been agreed upon by people who never asked who you were beyond it. You are currency, yes, but you are still breathing, still thinking, still waiting. And waiting, once again, is the hardest price to pay. The change starts with your name, or rather, with how often it's not used anymore. You hear a new version of yourself spoken aloud, shorter, softer, easier to pronounce in this place. At first, you assume it's a translation issue. Then you realize it's deliberate. Names carry history. Removing them lightens the load. This was common enough to be boring to administrators and devastating to the people living it. A mainstream historical fact. Captured royal women were frequently renamed, retitled, or quietly stripped of their original styles to ease their absorption into new courts. You weren't erased outright. You were edited. It's presented as courtesy. Your name is difficult for our people. This form is more appropriate here. This title avoids confusion. Confusion, you learn, is what happens when two versions of you exist at once. The solution is simplification. You're still addressed respectfully. That's the trick. Respect without recognition. Your old identity becomes something private, like a childhood nickname no one else remembers. You repeat it silently sometimes, just to hear it survive. Clothing changes next. Not dramatically, no sackcloth transformation, but subtly. Colours shift. Cuts align with local norms. Jewellery disappears piece by piece, under the logic of practicality. You're told it's safer, less conspicuous. You notice how quickly your reflection starts to look like someone else. Historians still argue whether this was intentional assimilation or simply logistical adaptation. Living through it, the distinction feels thin. You're encouraged to adopt new customs, greeting styles, meal etiquette, prayer posture. None of it is forced. That's important. Force creates resistance. Encouragement creates compliance that feels earned. You find yourself correcting your own mistakes before anyone else does. That realization lands heavier than any reprimand. A quirky historical tidbit floats up as you struggle with a new form of address. Some Norman captives in medieval England were required to adopt Anglo-Saxon naming conventions, while their original names survived only in monastic records. Historians still debate whether this was administrative convenience or cultural domination. You suspect it was both, neatly aligned. Language becomes the next frontier. You already speak some of it, but now fluency is expected. Accents are corrected gently, idioms explained. You're praised when you sound local. Praise, you've learned, is a lever. You accept it carefully. You start dreaming in fragments of the new language. That's when panic hits. Dreams were supposed to be safe, unmonitored. The mind, however, adapts faster than loyalty. You wake up unsettled, wondering which parts of you are negotiable without your permission. Your attendants change, old ones reassigned or dismissed, new ones trained in this court's rhythms. They're kind, mostly, efficient. They don't know the old version of you, which means they can't accidentally reflect it back. This is peaceful in a way that feels like loss. There's pressure, soft, persistent, to embrace your new role fully. New alliances, new patron saints, new narratives about your past that frame it as a prelude to here. You listen to these stories being told around you, slowly replacing the old ones. Historians still argue whether such narrative reshaping was propaganda or psychological necessity. You notice how easy it is to let others tell your story when correcting them feels exhausting. You're occasionally asked about your homeland, not with hostility but with curiosity. You answer in generalities. Specifics invite comparison. Comparison invites judgment. You learn to describe your past like a travel destination you once visited and don't plan to return to. The most unsettling part is how normal this starts to feel. You laugh at the right jokes. You anticipate customs before they're explained. Your body stops bracing when someone calls you by the new name. Adaptation is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It just happens. Fire returns again, faintly, metaphorically. A hearth you're allowed to sit near now. Warmth shared, not withheld. Inclusion is the reward for assimilation. You feel it working on you, and you don't entirely resist. Warmth feels good. That's not a moral failure. It's physiology. Historians still argue whether absorbed royal women wielded hidden influence or were simply neutralized. The answer, as always, depends on the woman, the court, the moment. You sense that power here exists in subtleties, in timing, in tone, in what you don't say. Your original name surfaces rarely now, usually in formal documents or distant correspondence. When you see it, it looks slightly wrong, like a misspelling of something you used to recognize. That frightens you more than forgetting would have. Forgetting is passive. This is transformation. You realize that erasure doesn't always mean disappearance. Sometimes it means continuity under new labels. You are still alive, still thinking, still shaping small outcomes where you can. The cost is that the story of who you were becomes negotiable. At night, you repeat your old name quietly, not as resistance, but as acknowledgement. It existed. You existed. Both can be true at once. Tomorrow, you'll wake up as the person this place expects. Tonight, you let both versions of yourself sit together in the dark, sharing the same breath, neither fully winning, neither entirely gone. Whispers arrive before anyone does. Soft words carried through corridors, flickering candlelight, servants' footsteps. You catch fragments of scandal, rumor, gossip, names spoken incorrectly, allegiances questioned. Sometimes these stories are amusing, sometimes bitterly unfair, always impossible to control. Captivity ensures your life becomes a narrative everyone edits but you. Mainstream history records this clearly. Captured royal women were constant subjects of speculation. Chroniclers, letter writers, and poets each had their version of events, often mixing fact with invention. Your accomplishments, missteps, even moments of quiet endurance are reframed as cautionary tales or heroic legends. You learn early that reputation is as much a cage as walls. You overhear them whispering, "She cried in private, but her guards never saw. She smiled when the letters came. She influenced that council without ever speaking." Which is true? Which is story? Historians still argue whether many chronicled scandals were real events or invented to satisfy political and literary tastes. Inside, it hardly matters. The world outside is already rewriting you. Rumors flourish because you are useful. Each story, true or false, becomes another tool in negotiations. A tale of suffering may generate sympathy. A tale of cunning may inspire fear. Someone once noted a queen's hair had turned silver overnight during captivity, a detail that became shorthand for endurance in manuscripts. Quirky historical tidbit. In some cases, captured women were rumoured to have secret lovers among their guards or distant nobles, stories that may have been entirely fabricated to keep morale or attention focused elsewhere. You find humour in it sometimes. Light humour. At least the type that keeps despair at bay. That one chronicler who claimed you rode a white horse across enemy territory while juggling treaties. Absurd, yet you smile. Others might have suffered through similar exaggerations. You laugh quietly, alone in your chamber, letting your body relax for a moment. A small rebellion, unrecorded. Scandal isn't only external. You hear it from your new attendants and visiting envoys. Each wants to know how you behave when unsupervised, how you respond under pressure, what secret alliances you might have. Every action becomes a potential story, every silence a statement. The mundane now carries weight you could never have imagined. Over time, you realize rumors are also shields. Stories of bravery, wisdom, and even deception keep you alive in some ways. People hesitate before harming a legend. Safety is sometimes found in exaggeration, in the blurring of truth. Historians still debate whether these stories empowered captive women or trapped them further in myth. You notice it's both. Some rumors follow you for decades, tales of wit, negotiation, compassion and endurance survive in letters and chronicles long after you've left confinement. Myths sprout from necessity. A queen needed to appear incorruptible, clever, resilient, untouchable. Reality and legend intertwine, making your captivity more complex than anyone could have anticipated. You catch yourself rehearsing stories silently, preparing to navigate their narrative yourself, carefully adjusting tone, selecting details, conserving credibility. This is strategy masquerading as thoughtfulness. You recognize it as survival, honed through months or years of observation. Meanwhile, false stories are inevitable. You are credited with actions you never took, alliances you never forged, betrayals you never contemplated. Some of these bring opportunity, others danger. You learn to accept this imbalance, knowing the world prefers a story it can retell rather than a truth it cannot measure. You are constantly performing, even when unseen. Your very presence communicates. Poise, composure, small gestures of politeness, even minor frustrations, all filtered through perception. Every movement carries potential misinterpretation. You realize that captivity extends far beyond physical walls. It exists in reputation, in narrative, in rumor. Scandals aside, you discover quiet victories, moments when a whispered compliment or a subtly phrased letter alters opinion or earns concession. Influence doesn't disappear in captivity, it just disguises itself. Your story becomes a subtle form of power, a weapon shaped entirely from perception. At night, you reflect on how many lives these rumors touched. Allies, enemies, strangers reading accounts decades later. You understand that history is always a conversation between what happened and what others wanted it to mean. Your life is caught in that dialogue, woven into myth and reality alike. You accept, finally, that you will never control every version of yourself. But you can choose some fragments, which stories to nurture, which truths to guard. Even in captivity, influence persists, quietly, invisibly, like embers glowing beneath ashes. And when the corridors fall silent, the candles burn low, and the world outside finally stops shouting about you, you realize this is where legends are born, not in battles or balls, but in the hushed, relentless echo of rumor. The corridors you now inhabit are quieter than before, though the walls have not changed. Time seems to have thickened, accumulating in corners and beneath the doors. You move through it, almost unconsciously, following patterns you've memorized long ago. The soft creak of floorboards, the way shadows shift with the afternoon light, the faint metallic scent that drifts from the kitchen below. Captivity has given you an intimate knowledge of these spaces, and yet the world outside still feels like a different dimension, one you may never touch again. Visitors continue to arrive, though less frequently. Officials, clerics, distant relatives, all bearing gifts, questions or instructions. You nod, smile, and speak politely, measuring every gesture and tone. Each word you utter is catalogued, each pause observed. A mainstream historical fact. During the 15th century, noblewomen held in foreign courts were often expected to act as cultural intermediaries, relaying information about their homeland while carefully maintaining the appearance of compliance. Even as you feel constrained, You are still a bridge between worlds. But you have also discovered small freedoms. They are almost invisible, choosing a book to read, lingering over a candlelit sketch, whispering a prayer in a language no one else speaks. These tiny acts, inconsequential to anyone else, feel like reclamations of self. You are allowed to exist in the interstices, those spaces between surveillance and ritual, between the expectations imposed on you and the person you still remember yourself to be. A quirky historical tidbit surfaces. Some royal women in the Ottoman Empire were permitted to maintain small gardens within their quarters, where they cultivated herbs or flowers. It was not merely pastime, it became an extension of control. The court could claim benevolence while the women exercised subtle autonomy. Historians still argue whether these gardens were truly liberating or just another form of monitored occupation. You imagine planting something yourself, even if only in your mind, a small, secret rebellion against a world that has measured your worth in alliances, gold and heirs. Your body too has adapted. Muscles that once tensed at every step now relax at predictable rhythms. Your breathing follows the pattern of daily life here. Hunger, fatigue, even discomfort have become manageable, like old companions rather than threats. You marvel at how the human body adjusts to confinement, even when the mind struggles to reconcile freedom and limitation. Scholars still debate whether long-term captivity permanently alters mental resilience, but you can feel the truth. Survival has reshaped you quietly and irrevocably. Letters arrive, carefully censored and delivered with restraint. Some are from your homeland, dripping with concern or veiled frustration. Others are administrative, updates about your estates, inquiries about alliances, financial matters you cannot yet control. You read between the lines, noting what is omitted as carefully as what is included. Every silence carries information. Every delay is intentional. Information becomes another form of currency, subtle yet potent. You discover too that rumor can serve as protection. Courtiers speak of you in hushed tones, sometimes exaggerating your influence or framing minor acts as clever manipulations. The stories float back to you, like leaves on a stream. They are both dangerous and comforting. Dangerous because perception can reshape reality. Comforting because others have not entirely erased your presence. Historians still argue whether such myths helped captive women retain power or merely distracted them from their vulnerability. You think it is both. At night, when the lamps flicker low, you watch shadows stretch across the walls. You have grown attuned to the subtle play of light and dark here, the way it shifts with the hour, the way it responds to unseen winds. Sometimes you find yourself tracing patterns in the fading glow, imagining maps, borders, or forgotten rooms. You remember earlier nights when the fire in the hearth seemed a distant metaphor, and now it is almost real, warming the floorboards and casting comfort along your spine. You have learned in small, quiet ways to negotiate with the world of captivity, not with defiance, which could be dangerous, not with total compliance, which could be erasing, but with subtlety, timing, observation. You measure gestures, evaluate speech, adjust posture. A glance, a sigh, a pause, all become tools. Survival is no longer merely about staying alive. It is about maintaining presence, influence, and the self beneath layers of expectation. A mainstream historical fact surfaces again. Women like Margaret of Anjou or Juana la Loca exercised influence while imprisoned, negotiating political matters, estates, or correspondence despite physical confinement. Even isolated, they shaped events. This realization comforts you. Perhaps captivity cannot strip everything. Perhaps some power, however subtle, remains. You meditate on the passage of seasons. Sunlight now falls differently through the window. Rain leaves streaks across the stone walls. You notice your reflection in a polished table and recognize someone altered, tempered and cautious, but still undeniably yourself. The reflection reminds you that life continues even within walls designed to contain it. A quirky historical tidbit arises from memory. Certain noble women in captivity created coded embroidery patterns, each stitch encoding information about allies, resources or sentiments, effectively communicating under the watchful eyes of guards. Historians still debate whether these were widespread methods of clandestine diplomacy or isolated ingenuity. You feel a thrill imagining your own small, silent codes woven into daily routines. As the day drifts toward night, you listen to distant conversations, the soft murmur of wind through latticed windows, the quiet movements of servants. Every sound is a reminder you are alive, present, and perceptive. Every whisper and shadow is a thread in the tapestry of your ongoing existence. You realize that captivity is not just a physical state but a psychological negotiation, and you have grown skilled at navigating both. You lie back on your bed and close your eyes. The room is still, yet alive with subtle motion, the sway of curtains, the ticking of clocks, the faint scent of wax and herbs. You are contained, yes, but you are also quietly sovereign over small domains of thought, memory, and reflection. Even here, influence exists in gestures, observation, and stories told in whispers. Tonight, the walls feel less like prisons and more like spaces shaped by endurance. You recognize that the survival of self is a layered practice: awareness, patience, subtlety, and the quiet cultivation of identity. Captivity has not stripped your capacity to act, it has only refined it. You breathe slowly, deliberately, and let the subtle rhythm of your environment become a lullaby. Tomorrow, there will be visitors. Negotiations may resume. Rumors will circulate. Alliances will shift. Yet tonight, you have reclaimed a fragment of time, a fragment of self, in the soft glow of your chamber. By now, you have grown accustomed to the strange rhythms of your life. Days blend into weeks, and weeks into months, each marked not by calendars, but by subtle shifts in light, the changing sounds outside your window, the rotation of guards who have come to know your pace and posture as if it were a language. This rhythm is both prison and comfort. You've discovered that predictability is a kind of survival tool, a way to carve agency in a world built to contain you. Letters continue to arrive, though their tone shifts with the seasons and political winds. Some carry news of your homeland, always filtered through distance and delay. You read them with care, knowing that even words can be a form of confinement. They are reminders of everything you cannot control. Mainstream historical fact. During the Middle Ages, correspondence from distant courts was often heavily censored or rewritten by intermediaries, leaving royal women reliant on fragments of truth. You learn to read not just the words, but the spaces between them. You are encouraged to maintain your studies, arts, or craft. Books, musical instruments, sketches, all are permitted, provided they remain under observation. The act of creation becomes a delicate rebellion, a quirky historical tidbit. Margaret Beaufort, mother of Henry VII, used her embroidery and prayers while confined as a young girl to influence allies and communicate secretly. Historians still debate whether such activities were purely personal or subtly political, but the impact is clear. You understand that even the smallest gestures can ripple outward. Visits become more formalized. You meet diplomats, clergy, or minor royals who ask questions of your loyalty, temperament, and future intentions. These conversations feel like duels without swords. Measured words, careful tone, subtle tests of patience and wit. Your survival relies on your ability to perform compliance while preserving internal autonomy. Each exchange sharpens your perception, teaching you to spot micro-expressions, pauses, and emphasis. The invisible currency of power in a constrained world. Your physical space remains unchanged, yet your mind transforms it. Walls, doors, and furniture no longer merely contain you. They frame the stages on which you rehearse patience, subtle influence, and quiet observation. You notice small details others overlook. The way light catches dust motes, the faint whine of iron hinges, the subtle differences in floorboard texture after rainfall. Historians still argue whether these attentiveness habits were adaptive coping mechanisms or simply human curiosity intensified by isolation. From your perspective, they are both. Religion and ritual continue to structure your days. Prayer, meditation, and contemplation are no longer only about devotion. They are also exercises in maintaining psychological balance. Small personal rituals, touching a talisman, arranging a candle, counting steps, become tools for self-preservation. They remind you that though your freedom is curtailed, your mind retains sovereignty over certain spaces. You discover the quiet power of repetition and routine, a power that cannot easily be measured by outsiders. You begin to notice subtle alliances forming around you, attendants who favor you, guards who hesitate to be harsh, messengers who carry a glimmer of empathy in their eyes. Influence emerges from patience, observation, and strategic kindness. Quirky historical tidbit: some captive princesses in the Italian city-states cultivated loyalty among staff through carefully timed small favors, gestures of courtesy, or shared secrets. Scholars still debate whether such methods had tangible political effects, but within the walls, they create networks that matter immensely. Rumors continue to swirl, both about you and from you. You realize they are tools. Misinformation can protect, exaggeration can intimidate, and silence can confuse. The line between truth and story blurs. You learn to wield perception as deftly as any sword, understanding that even captivity cannot contain influence entirely. Historians still argue whether these strategies were conscious acts of diplomacy or instinctive survival techniques. In practice, it is both. You begin reflecting on memory itself. Your past life, once vivid, now drifts like a distant melody. Details sharpen and fade in turns, colored by the present. Fire from distant memories glows faintly, warming recollections of family, home, and freedom. Yet you notice your inner voice is unbroken, narrating your life with subtle commentary, humor, and quiet defiance. The mind, it seems, is its own sanctuary. As the day wanes, you watch shadows lengthen across the floor. You recognize how far you've come, from raw fear to measured endurance, from confusion to strategic observation, from enforced compliance to subtle influence. The world outside may continue to negotiate, speculate, and reinterpret your story, but inside you have cultivated a private domain. Even under surveillance, you are sovereign over your thoughts, your rituals, and your small acts of quiet rebellion. Night brings its own lessons. Silence falls differently than it did in the early weeks. The air is still, but alive with memory, anticipation, and reflection. You notice subtle sounds, distant footsteps, the rustle of fabric, the sigh of the wind. Each one is a reminder that life continues, inside and outside these walls, and that survival is measured not merely in endurance but in the preservation of self. Tomorrow, you will rise, follow the same steps, endure similar scrutiny, and yet wield influence in ways invisible to your captors. You have learned that freedom is not always a matter of exit, but of navigation, adaptation, and the quiet cultivation of resilience. Each day survived is an act of subtle power, each observation a thread connecting you to a life beyond these walls. By now, you are intimately familiar with the rhythms of waiting. You move through the halls almost by memory, each step a quiet negotiation with time. Light drifts differently than it once did, shadows stretching across walls in ways that seem to mark the passing of not just hours, but lifetimes. You notice the small things, the subtle creak of the door when opened, the faint scent of herbs left by attendants, the irregular flutter of birds outside the window. Each detail is recorded silently in your mind, a private catalogue of survival. You've learned to wield observation as a tool. Conversations are measured, gestures calculated, and silences carefully timed. Every visitor, every courier, every minor official becomes part of a complex choreography, each step you take balancing compliance and subtle influence. Mainstream historical fact: many captured royal women, from Margaret of Anjou to Juana la Loca, exerted considerable political influence from within confinement, shaping alliances, estates, and even battles through correspondence, diplomacy, and subtle negotiation. Your own experience echoes this, revealing that captivity rarely eliminates power, it simply transforms it. Rumor remains a constant companion. Whispers about your demeanor, allegiances, and actions circulate with a life of their own. Some exaggerate your cleverness, others hint at transgressions. Quirky historical tidbit: in 16th century Europe, some captive noblewomen were said to maintain secret message systems woven into embroidery or hidden in musical notation, transmitting intelligence under the watchful eye of their captors. Historians still debate how widespread or effective these methods truly were, but the idea fascinates you. Even now, you imagine hidden codes in mundane acts, subtle rebellions folded into daily life. Your sense of self has grown layered and nuanced. You are simultaneously the person who was captured, the person surviving day to day, and the person imagined by others through rumour and report. All three coexist, each shaping your decisions, your strategies, your patience. Historians still argue whether this multiplicity strengthened captive women or created psychological strain. You sense both realities, navigating them with careful attention. At night, the quiet returns. You sit by the hearth, watching embers glow faintly, their warmth spreading slowly, predictably like a meditation. Fire has become a companion, a witness to your persistence. You recall earlier stages of captivity, the starkness, the constant supervision, the fear, and marvel at how endurance reshapes perception. Even small comforts are now magnified, a candle flicker, a soft breeze through a lattice, the sound of distant footsteps. Letters, visitors, and negotiations continue, but they no longer dominate your attention. Instead, your mind finds its own cadence. You record thoughts, reflect on history, and imagine futures both possible and impossible. Even as the world reshapes the story of your life, you retain fragments entirely your own. Each breath, each silent observation, each small act of agency becomes proof that captivity does not entirely erase identity. The days have taught you resilience, patience, and subtlety. You have learned that influence can persist without visibility, that survival often means negotiation on unseen levels, and that the mind can remain sovereign even when the body is constrained. Your life is no longer defined solely by walls or restrictions, but by the strategies, rituals, and quiet acts of endurance you have cultivated. And so, in the quiet of your chamber, with firelight dancing across stone walls, you recognize a hard-earned truth. Captivity changes form, it molds, it pressures, it tests, but it does not have the final word. The self that observes, adapts, and persists remains, quietly sovereign, quietly powerful. The fire burns low tonight, its embers glowing like tiny hearts scattered across the hearth. You watch them, letting their warmth seep into your shoulders, down your spine, into the spaces that have carried the weight of walls, rumours, and negotiations for so long. Outside, the world continues its motions, footsteps, distant voices, the whisper of wind. But here, in this quiet, time feels softer, stretched, unhurried. You breathe slowly, letting each inhale and exhale trace the contours of memory, endurance, and quiet survival. Your eyes follow the flicker of light across the stone, imagining rivers of warmth flowing outward, touching every corner of the room. Shadows retreat and fold gently into themselves, reminding you that night is not absence but transformation. You feel the rhythm of your own heartbeat, steady and reassuring, as if it is saying, "You have endured, you have persisted, and you remain intact in ways that no captivity could erase." Memories drift through you, vivid yet softened, like embers that glow longer in the mind than in the hearth. You recall laughter, whispers, letters, and secrets, all fragments of a life reshaped but not lost. You let them settle around you, a protective layer that holds both sorrow and quiet joy. The lessons of endurance, subtle influence, and patient observation mingle with dreams yet to come, forming a tapestry that belongs only to you. The night grows deeper. The warmth of fire and memory coalesces, carrying you gently towards sleep. Outside, noises soften, embers fade, breath deepens. You feel a calm certainty that even as the world continues its negotiations, its whispers, and its chaos, you are safe in this moment. Good night. Let the embers glow softly in your mind and drift into dreams where you are whole, sovereign, and free.